So it's an exciting day in the garden. We're going to plant out the tomatoes. So I've put the tomatoes where I want them in the square foot. There's one inside the middle of each square. There's 3 squares here with plants around them. Everything is growing quite well, so the garden or the ground is well covered and helps hold the moisture into the ground, which is good for us. We've had a good amount of rainfall, so I know the ground's quite wet already. If it wasn't, then I'd want to give it a good water. So first of all, I've got myself a good tomato seedling here. It's in a pot, there's roots forming down here. What I've got now is I've got branches coming off with extra intermediate growth. I could actually pinch them off, or I could let them grow on a little bit longer and then chop them off with a secateurs or a sharp knife and actually plant them into the ground themselves as a new cutting, and then pass on some more tomato plants to people. And you can see the hairs on the tomato plant all the way up. Now if I wanted to, I know that these could form roots out the side of this. So, and I've got a good height here, so what I'm going to do, I would make a hole as deep as I can in this raised bed, and I'd plant my tomato right at the base of that, so that I had a good potential for growing more roots out of the plant, which gives them a better chance for having access to nutrients and water. I'm being gentle as I dig because I've got roots of other plants in here as well. As you can see, my hand is going to go in. So the hole is about the height of my hand. So I've got myself a nice deep hole. Now bear in mind this bed is made out of compost and it's not soil. So I know that compost is really only a food source and a substrate. So it's a substrate for roots to grow in, and it's a food source for the life within the compost, the enzymes, the bacteria, the fungi, all the different organisms, the different worms and the different parts that make up that ecosystem, and break down all of those bigger parts and turn it into plant food and food for other organisms to feed off. So I know I'm going to have to add in extra nutrient into that compost to make sure that I've got enough food for all of this plant life that's growing on in it. If I'm in a well-maintained soil, then I might not need to put in so much extra nutrient or so many extra plants, because the soil life in there is already like a marketplace, transferring nutrients between one place and another. But because I'm in a brand new bed that's made up mostly compost, I'm going to have to make sure I'm feeding that ecosystem to get itself established. Here's my 3 different options for my fertilizer for the tomatoes. I'd sprinkle a handful of this at the base of the hole that I was putting the tomato plant in. Not overdoing it. I don't need a massive handful because I don't want to kill the plant off by adding too much nutrient or affect the ecosystem in the soil or compost too much. So on the right hand side, if there's an organic grower and I didn't have access to plants to make my organic fertilizer or liquid teas, I could use some blood, fish and bone. If I'm a standard gardener who wasn't looking for just organic principles, I might use something like a manufactured grow more, which would have a balanced fertilizer built in. It doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be an organic version. And if I wanted to look for more plant-based, then I might use something like nettles or comfrey and chop up those leaves to add some macro and micronutrients into the base of the tomato plants, just to help fertilize them as the plants are growing. Some people have even added crushed eggshells. Those crushed eggshells are believed to add calcium into the soil, but they do take a long time to break down. I'm going to add in some crushed nettles that I've chopped earlier, and I'm going to push them right to the base. Just as they break down, they can release extra nutrients from that. I could also sprinkle myself in a little bit of grow more, not too much, just a little small handful. And then if the bed wasn't completely saturated from the heavy rains, I would then want to water and fill this hole with water. And then I'd want that water to absorb into the local soil before I added in my tomato plant. As it is, that ground is nice and moist, so I want to get in my tomato plant. So I've got my pot, got my tomato plant. I'm going to gently grip the leaves. I'm just gently getting hold of the pot, and I'm just going to pull it out. I'm not grabbing it by the stem, I don't want to bruise that stem, and you can see there's a good amount of roots on that. It's definitely time for it to come out. So now I could just put it straight in the hole like that, But what I've got to consider is these tomato plants are going to grow really tall and they're going to need some form of support because these are a vine tomato. There might be a stick, a bamboo cane, it might be a metal frame, but in this garden I've got a lot of stuff growing around it. I'm going to use a string. Now on the bottom of that string I've got myself a loop. I'll just quickly show you how to do that. So here's a close-up of what I would do if I was using a string to support the tomato plant. I would fold it over to about 20 centimeters. I'd wrap it in a loop and then pull the end of the hoop through. What I want is something at the end of it, like that, which is roughly the size of the roots of the tomato. And then I'd make my hole, as you've seen already, and I would put this potentially around the base of the tomato as I'm putting it in the hole, and then leave it so the string was buried with the tomato, and the weight of the tomato and the roots of the tomato will hold the string down, and then I would tie it off at the top. So what I'm going to do is make sure that loop goes underneath the plant, have it on the back of the plant, and I'm going to bury it with it. So it's underneath the plant, the string's coming up the back. I'm just going to push the root ball right down, and I'm going to keep that string up as I then bury the good 7 to 10 centimeters of the plant underneath the compost. Now the reason I've got that string is I will attach it to the frame which is just behind, but I'll be able to, as the plant grows, I'll wrap the string around it in different parts just to give it some support, so when the wind blows or the fruit's growing on it, it doesn't cause the plant to bend over too quickly and snap the plant, losing all of that fruit or killing off the plant. It will also help keep the tomato upright because tomatoes will naturally just spread anywhere they like and on the ground, and they'll form roots everywhere. But the problem is the fruits will be too near the ground and they're more likely to get spoiled from slugs and snails and other animals that like to have a good munch. So I'll use that string as it grows just to give it extra grip. Now I could use other materials to do that. Just explain why I'm not going to use garden wire. Now I wouldn't use garden wire to trail my tomatoes up because if you can see from this picture, the garden wire is quite thin. So if that stem was forcing against it, because it's thin yet strong, that stem, which would be softer, would eventually bend or could snap around it. So although garden wire is nice and strong, it can cause damage to the plant. And because I've got twine, I'm going to use this. So now I'm just going to attach the twine right to the top. And because it's a long piece, I'll bring that twine back down for my next tomato plant. So when I'm doing that string, I'm making sure it's not too tight, so there's still a little bit of flex in it, so that I can wrap it round and move it around the tomato as it grows. If it's too tight, you'll end up having to move the tomato plant around it, and that might cause some damage to the tomato plant. So you can see the first tomato plant is in, the string is running up next to it, and all I would do is wrap the string around to the front of the plant now, and then that tomato plant will encourage to grow up here. Then I'll just encourage it behind the tomato plant to get it to come up the other side, and I'll keep going, but I've made sure there's enough flex in the string to do this. I'm not going to put it up hard because that will just lift up the whole plant, but as the plant grows, the roots establish out into the compost, that will stop it from lifting up and it will be held down from it. Now this is a heavy duty twine. If I use something like a garden string, like a green string, then what we'll find is as the season goes on, it will hold first of all, but as that plant gets heavier, moisture gets into that sort of garden twine, what we'll find is it will snap under the weight, and then suddenly down comes the vine tomatoes at quite a speed, and potentially can snap, bruise or damage the plant fruit and maybe kill off the plant together. So we are not going to do that. I've also got a little bit extra of the string so that when it comes to the bottom of this hole, what I can do is form my loop, wrap it round, tie it off, bury it in there, and any stuff sticking above the soil I can then just chop off. So let's dig the hole for the next one, as it's hiding behind the bush French beans. Let's get those runner beans to go up. Make sure they climb up there clockwise. You see the roots are coming out the base of this plat. It definitely tells me it's time for them to go in the ground. So right in the middle of this square. Let's dig ourselves a hole and being mindful not to damage any of those roots that I can feel going to. Right, I'm just going to add a little bit of bloodfish and bone. Half a handful. I don't need that much. I'm just going to sprinkle a little bit in there. I might just put a little bit on the surface, just around it. And I probably used less than a third of that. So now back to my plant. Same with the other plants. I'm going to grip it by the branches and the leaves, and I'm just going to ease the plant out of the container. Try not to damage any of those roots as I do it. So you can see that good root ball there. If it was really pot bound, I just want to break away those roots on the bottom to encourage them to grow out. The other good thing is I'm going to bury this into the ground, so I know I'm going to get roots coming out the side as well. So the ground's nice and moist, but again, if it wasn't nice and moist, I'd want to fill it with water, let that water absorb in, and then plant in the tomato. Didn't make the hole big enough. Let's move it to the side. There we go. So the hole's big enough for the tomato plant. Now I've got to deal with the string. So I'm just going to measure, put the string in the hole. So I know I need the loop below this point. So I'm going to get myself 20 centimeters, loop it over, keep to the point where I wanted it. And I've just got myself a loop that's just going to anchor itself underneath the plant and the roots. So I'm going to put that back in the hole. Oh, make sure the rest of the string doesn't damage any other plants. So that's gone in the bottom. I'm going to put my plant on top of it. I'm going to push it down. And now I'm going to put the soil back around it, all the way around, burying some of those side branches. Now, some of the side branches might root and push through and grow. That's okay, I don't mind that. A little bit of excess string, I don't need that. I'm just going to chop that off. There we are. So I've got a second one here. Now, because it's more already starting on the right hand side of the plant, I'm just going to bring it round to the front via the left. And again, as this grows up, I'll do the same. As I move on to my third tomato plant here, I'm away from the support structure. So for this, I've decided I'm going to use another branch, a piece of wood I've managed to find rather than the bamboo. It just gives me a bit more solid structure. And it's what I've got, it's not what I'm going to go and buy. So I'm using resources that I've found, but I'm going to need to make sure this goes down deep enough to make sure that stick's got a good anchorage point. This bed was built on top of membrane, so I know I'm going to have to go into the soil underneath. So as I've dug my hole right down to the bottom, I'm going to have to cut through the membrane, make a hole, and I'm going to push my stick right in. And that's before I think about planting the tomato. So you can see the tomato is amongst all these other plants. We've got the chard growing well on this side. We've got the coriander. In fact, the coriander is starting to go to seed. It's really been growing well. And we've got a nice bit of parsley behind it. So we're going to make ourselves a nice big hole for here. I'm going to put the soil at the back. I can feel the membrane underneath. The only sharp instrument I've got right now is my secateurs. Just make sure I clean them afterwards because I don't want to leave mud on them. Okay, got a nice big hole. Now what I need to do is get my big stick, push that right into the ground so it's nice and firm. I'm going to rotate it round so I get my tomato growing in towards the other ones. Okay, so I've got myself a nice deep hole all the way to the bottom. As I mentioned before, I might add a sprinkling of grow more. Remember, when handling the tomato plant, I want to handle it via the leaves and the branches, not holding the stem. I don't want to bruise that stem. Got roots at the bottom, so I'm just going to gently work the root ball out of the thing. Looking at that, it's not pot bound at all, so I can just put it straight in that hole. Put it close to that stick pushing it right in, and now I'm just going to start bringing that soil from behind to just bury that tomato plant. I'll just push it down a little bit on top. Now one thing I've got is I've still got myself some leftover nettles. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to add some nettles in around the base of these plants, just to allow them to break down and release that food source and those nutrients which are built up within them. The bacteria, the bugs, the grubs, the worms, and all of those other creatures in there, break them down. The other thing I might find is that the slugs and other creatures might prefer these rather than attacking any of my other plants. Now if I was thinking about companion gardening, then I might also want to get myself some marigolds and plant them around the base of the tomato plants, because they're good companions. They will attract the pollinators, but equally around the family of the Solanaceae family. So you've got your potatoes, your aubergines, your tomatoes in there. They will actually put off some of the nematodes and things that you might find attacking and damaging the tubers or the roots of the plants. So the oils that are secreted from the marigolds are a particularly useful element of it. Not so good around cabbages and other things like that, so you need to plant them away from those kinds of plants. So any of the brassicas, you need to make sure they're not growing too near. They're not fantastic right next to runner beans as well, so again, plant them outside of the root space. Let's just go and get ourselves some marigolds. So when we say marigolds, we are talking about tagetes. We're not talking about pot marigolds, which are actually calendulas. And although calendulas can also be very good for attracting the pollinators and the things that help set the fruit, they don't release the same oils and stuff in the ground and help in that way. So I'm just going to make a little hole. These are already in the Jiffy 7 bags or the koi, coconut powder, coconut flour, koi pots. So I'm just going to put that, make a little hole, get all those roots in, just bury that pot. Make sure the pot's not exposed because we don't want it to dry out and form a barrier for the roots. We're going to do the same on this side, and we'll find out whether marigolds affect the growth of coriander, which is doing really well and wanting to go to seed as the temperature hits up. So the difference between this tomato and the others is this is a solid, rigid support. I'm going to have to tie the tomato plant to. I might even use something like ivy plants or bindweed and just pull a section off that, which is enough to tie around the plant and the structure, and sort of just tie a little gentle knot in it. I like using things that are already growing around, so I probably couldn't get away with using grass. It's not particularly strong, but if I've got any sort of more thicker types of grasses in the garden, I could potentially use something like that. Or I could go and get some garden twine, which is the thinner, greener ropes, or the brown ropes, not as thick as the big sort of hop twine that I've got back there, and I could just tie little bits on there. So if the ground wasn't nice and moist, what I'd want to do once I've actually got my tomato plants in is then give the ground a nice good water. But the sun's beating down, the ground is already nice and moist, it's well covered with the other plants growing over it and with mulch on the ground. So I'm going to leave those tomatoes to get themselves established, and I'll come back in a couple of weeks in one of the update videos and let you know how they're getting on.